I will actually focus on two aspects. One is economic policies, about which we already heard a bit, but I will also talk a little bit about foreign policies. Sometimes foreign policy and economic policy is pretty much the same thing. But first things first, speaking about economic policies, very briefly and just giving you a sketch of things. So the sketch starts with 1929, which is commonly known as the Great Depression. Great Depression because for 3 years the world economy after the stock market collapse in 29 was in free fall. Question in terms of policy, how did countries react to that collapse? Well, in the liberal democracies, and there weren't too many in those days left, largely Britain and the United States, they had one policy principle which you are very familiar with because conservative and liberal governments, even the NDP one has to say, are always spitting this idea out, and the idea is the balanced budget. Applying the principle of the balanced budget in the 30s actually made the crisis ever worse. They had the simple argument, well, if we have less tax revenue, we can spend less, and for that matter, there is nothing we can do, even if we don't like this crisis to get deeper and deeper. Well, other countries were less dogmatic, and among the less dogmatic countries were Germany and Japan under slightly different political regimes. Under fascist regimes, those two countries actually embarked onto something which later would become known as Keynesianism, which simply said, we don't care whether we have the money or not, we spend it anyways. And that actually helped to pull these two countries out of economic crisis, but obviously it was preparing a political crisis of unprecedented scale, which is commonly known as the Second World War. Well, one country that should be mentioned in this respect, because at least parts of it belong to Europe, is the then existing Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is important in regards to economic policies in Western countries because it was seen by people who dearly hated it, but they still saw it as a country that managed to not have a crisis in the first place. In 1928, the first 5-year plan was announced, and it was considered a stunning success, even by the people who hated the Soviet Union. There were some kind of dissident communists in Western countries, but not who actually pointed out that there were major crises, major human disasters happening in the Soviet Union, kind of as the price for this drive towards industrialization, but nobody listens to dissident communists in the first place. Ironically enough, official communism and liberal politicians had the same idea. The Soviet Union is a success. Of course, the liberal politicians in the West didn't like it. Now, what about today? Today we don't have a Great Depression, at least not yet. Maybe we will have one. Currently, we might speak about the Great Recession. We had a kind of free fall for about 6 months, and then it was slowing up, down, it was bottoming out. And why was that happening? Well, because we have neoliberal governments, that's the kind of government that preaches the balanced budget constantly, but hardly anyone sticks to that principle. Even the Canadians, who were the last to discover, well, we might not be able to, but even the Canadians jumped on that bandwagon of spending money which they actually don't have yet. This spending money helped to stop the free falling of the economy. In the 30s, we had kind of competition over who's the toughest kid on the block. For a long time, the Brits were actually used to be the toughest on the block. They had built an empire over a very long time, and they were trying to hold on to it. And the name of holding on to their empire in economic terms had a name which was called the gold standard. But there, of course, was the other, across the ocean, there was the United States. And after the First World War, then President Wilson had declared, we have to open the doors to US capital. He had the vision of the United States being the toughest kid on the block. However, that was fairly controversial in his days, and in fact, some of his ruling class colleagues thought either it's not what we should do in the first place, or more importantly, we are not ready yet. Let's wait a bit. So the British could have the impression that the Americans were quite happy on their big island and just waiting what's going on in Europe. And something was going on in Europe and, of course, in Asia. I have to come back to Germany and Japan because those two countries, they not only figured how to get out of the crisis by avoiding socialism, not embarking on 5-year plans or any such thing, but getting out of the crisis built on a capitalist economy. And the answer was Keynesianism, and in terms of foreign policy, the answer was, well, if in the course of the Depression the world market is faltering, disintegrating anyways, well, why not carve out our pieces?